March 15, 2024. Devon Cross had been making demands all morning. Triple his salary or he walks. The 28-year-old pretty boy stood in front of 300 cast and crew members, humiliating veteran director Marcus Webb for what he called a poverty-level paycheck. Cuck Norris watched from behind the camera, silent, stone-faced, calculating. What happened in the next 4 minutes would end Devon's career forever. It would also expose the darkest secret in Hollywood history, a secret that connected these two men in ways no one could imagine. The industry held its breath for weeks afterward. Agents made phone calls, lawyers filed papers, and for the first time in 30 years, people started asking questions about Marcus Webb's father, the man who trained Cuck Norris, the man whose career ended the night Cucks began. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. The Almeria sun beat down mercilessly on the desert set, turning the Spanish landscape into a furnace that matched the tension crackling through the air. Cuck Norris felt sweat trickling down his spine beneath his black polo shirt, but his face remained carved from granite as he watched Devon Cross's performance, not the scripted kind. "You want me to what?" Devon's voice carried across the set like a whip crack. He stood center stage in the makeshift town square, designer sunglasses reflecting the harsh light, his perfectly styled hair somehow immune to the desert wind. "Work for peanuts while you guys pocket millions?" Marcus Webb, 73 years old with hands that shook slightly when he held his coffee cup, stood 5 feet away looking like a man who'd been slapped in public, which, in Hollywood terms, he had been. The veteran director's weathered face flushed red above his gray beard, but his voice remained steady. "Your contract was signed 6 months ago, son. We've been through this." "Son?" Devon laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. "Don't son me, old man. I've seen your previous work. B-movies and straight-to-video garbage. The only reason this picture has any heat is because of Cuck's name attached, and the only reason anyone will buy tickets is to see me." The 300 cast and crew members formed an unwilling audience, their conversations dying as Devon's voice rose. Grips stopped adjusting lights. Script supervisors looked up from their tablets. Even the catering crew emerged from their truck to witness the spectacle. Cuck's jaw tightened imperceptibly. His gray eyes, the same shade as gunmetal, tracked every gesture, every sneer that crossed Devon's face. The kid had his father's bone structure, the same aristocratic jawline that had made James Cross a heartthrob in the 70s. But where James had possessed quiet dignity, his son radiated entitled arrogance. "Triple my rate, or I'm on the next flight to Madrid," Devon continued, pulling out his phone with theatrical flair. "I've got Scorsese's people calling twice a day." Marcus Webb's hands weren't shaking anymore. They'd curled into fists at his sides. "You're under contract, Cross. Legal's already been through this. You walk, we sue." "Sue away, Grandpa." Devon stepped closer, invading the older man's personal space. "By the time it goes to court, I'll be doing press tours for a real movie, not some geriatric western nobody asked for." That's when Cuck moved. He didn't run or shout. He simply stepped out from behind the camera and walked across the 30 yards of desert sand with the deliberate pace of a man who'd learned long ago that true power didn't need to announce itself. His boots made soft, crunching sounds in the sand, the only noise in a silence that had descended like a curtain. Devon must have sensed the shift in atmosphere because he turned, that practiced Hollywood smile still plastered across his face. "Cuck, maybe you can talk some sense into your boy here. Explain how the movie business actually works." Cuck stopped 3 feet away. Up close, the resemblance was even stronger. The kid had James's eyes, too, that piercing blue that used to see right through bullshit and pretense. Ironic, considering what his son had become. "How much?" Cuck's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the desert quiet, every word carried. "What? How much do you think you're worth?" Devon's smile widened, mistaking the question for capitulation. $3.5 million. That's what Hemsworth got for his last action flick, and I guarantee I'll deliver twice his box office. Cuck nodded slowly, as if considering the figure. Behind Devon, Marcus Webb watched with the careful attention of a man who'd worked with Cuck Norris for 23 years. who'd seen that particular expression before. "You know what your father would have said about that number?" Cuck asked, his tone conversational. The change in Devon's face was instantaneous. The cocky smile faltered, replaced by something harder, more calculating. "My father? James Cross. Hell of a stuntman. Hell of a teacher." Cuck's eyes never left Devon's face. "Taught me everything I know about taking a punch, about honor, about keeping your word." The silence stretched like a taut wire. 300 people held their breath, sensing they were witnessing something bigger than a salary dispute, something that ran deeper than Hollywood politics. Devon's voice dropped to match Cuck's whisper. "You knew my father. It wasn't a question." "I did. Then you know what happened to him." Cuck's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, a shadow of memory, of guilt buried so deep it had calcified into scar tissue. "I know." Devon took off his sunglasses, revealing those piercing blue eyes blazing with 30 years of accumulated rage. "Good. Then you know why I'm really here." The desert wind picked up, stirring the sand around their feet like a restless spirit. In the distance, a hawk circled in the cloudless sky, waiting for something to die. The words hung in the desert air like smoke from a gunfight, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, Cuck Norris felt the weight of 3 decades pressing down on his shoulders like the merciless Spanish sun. The hawk overhead let out a piercing cry that seemed to mock the silence below. Marcus Webb was the first to move, his weathered hand reaching toward Cuck's arm with the protective instinct of a loyal friend. But Cuck stepped back, never breaking eye contact with Devon Cross, whose blue eyes burned with the same intensity his father's once had, back when James Cross still believed in things like justice and second chances. "Everyone back to work," Cuck said quietly, his voice carrying across the set with an authority that had commanded respect for 2 decades. "We're losing light." The crew hesitated, sensing they were witnessing something historic, something that would be whispered about in Hollywood bars for years to come. But when Cuck Norris gave an order, you followed it. Slowly, reluctantly, the 300 people began to disperse, though conversations remained muted and every ear stayed tuned to the drama unfolding in the makeshift town square. Devon didn't move, neither did Cuck. They stood facing each other like gunfighters in the western they were supposed to be filming, shadows growing longer as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the Sierra Nevada mountains. 30 years, Devon said, his voice barely audible now. 30 years I've been waiting for this moment. Cuck's mind raced backward through time, past the awards and accolades, past the carefully constructed image of the humble action hero who always credited his stunt team, always thanked his mentors. Back to 1993, to another desert, another film, another young man with dreams bigger than his conscience. James Cross had been 43 then, Cuck's senior by 15 years and infinitely more experienced. The kind of stunt coordinator who could make a 28-year-old nobody look like Clint Eastwood, who shared his knowledge freely and never asked for credit. James had seen something in Cuck, potential maybe, or just the desperate hunger that reminded him of his own younger self. "Your father was a good man," Cuck said finally, the words scraping his throat raw. Devon's laugh was bitter as desert wind, past tense, because good men don't survive in this business, do they, Cuck? They get thrown under the bus by ambitious kids who learn to smile for the cameras while stabbing their mentors in the back. Marcus Webb had moved closer again, his face pale beneath his desert tan. He'd been there too, 30 years ago. He'd seen the whole thing unfold like a car crash in slow motion, the insurance investigation, the studio executives demanding someone to blame, the choice between destroying a rising star's career or sacrificing an aging stuntman who'd already made his mark. "Marcus," Cuck said without turning around, "give us the set." "Cuck, maybe we should give us the set." The old director looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Cuck's tone brooked no discussion. Marcus nodded reluctantly and began herding the remaining crew members toward the catering area, leaving the 2 men alone among the plywood facades and artificial tumbleweeds. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of wind through the rigging and the distant hum of generators. Devon's hands had stopped shaking. His famous features had settled into a mask of cold determination that was eerily reminiscent of his father's expression during those final days on the 1993 set, when James Cross had realized his career was over, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "He never talked about it," Devon said, his voice softer now but no less dangerous. "Not once. Came home from that picture and never spoke about what happened. But I wasn't stupid. I was 23. I could read between the lines." Cuck remembered that too. James going home each night to his wife and son, carrying the weight of a destroyed reputation with the same quiet dignity he'd brought to every stunt, every fall, every perfectly choreographed piece of violence that had made other men look like heroes. "The drinking started that winter," Devon continued. "Then the pills. Then the silence that lasted for months. You know what it's like watching your hero disappear piece by piece. Watching the strongest man you've ever known crumble because some studio executives needed a scapegoat and you were too old to fight back." The desert wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Somewhere in the mountains, storm clouds were gathering, though the sky overhead remained mercilessly clear. Cuck felt sweat cooling on his skin, felt the familiar ache in his lower back from 3 decades of carefully hidden guilt. "He died believing he'd failed," Devon whispered. "Believing he was responsible for that stuntman's injury. Believing the lies you all told because it was easier than admitting the truth." Cuck closed his eyes for just a moment, seeing James Cross's face as clearly as if 30 years had never passed. Proud, broken, trusting until the very end that someone would speak up for him. "I know," Cuck said. "Good." Devon's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Then you know I'm here to collect a debt." The words settled between them like dust after an explosion. Cuck felt something fundamental shift inside his chest, a tectonic plate of guilt that had been dormant for 3 decades suddenly grinding to life. This wasn't just about money or ego or Hollywood politics anymore. This was reckoning. Devon reached into his jacket pocket with deliberate slowness, his movements controlled and purposeful. When his hand emerged, he held a manila envelope, creased and worn at the edges as if it had been handled countless times over the years. The paper was yellowed with age, and Cuck could see his own name written across the front in handwriting he recognized immediately. James Cross's careful script. The same penmanship that had filled storyboards and safety reports, that had written birthday cards to cast members and detailed notes about proper fall techniques. Cuck's stomach dropped like he'd missed a high wire. "He wrote this 3 days before he died," Devon said, his voice steady as granite. 15 years ago, massive coronary in a Motel 6 outside Bakersfield, working as a safety consultant on some straight-to-video piece of shit, because it was the only work he could get. The envelope seemed to pulse in Devon's hands like a living thing. Cuck could feel his carefully constructed world beginning to crack at the foundation. 30 years of success and accolades, suddenly feeling as fragile as the plywood facades surrounding them. "I found this in his truck afterward," Devon continued, "along with newspaper clippings. Every article about your career, every interview where you talked about honor and loyalty and crediting your mentors, he kept them all." Cuck's mouth had gone dry as the desert around them. "Devon." "He never mailed it." Devon's interruption cut like a blade. "Never called. Never showed up at your premieres or your award ceremonies, even though he had something to say. You know why?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Cuck knew the answer, had always known it, but hearing it spoken aloud would make it real in a way that 30 years of buried conscience couldn't touch. "Because he still believed in you," Devon whispered. "Right up until the end, he thought there was good in the man he'd taught everything he knew. Thought maybe you'd been forced into something you couldn't control, that maybe someday you'd find the courage to tell the truth." Devon held out the envelope, and Cuck stared at it like it might bite him. His name on the front seemed to shimmer in the desert heat, and he could almost feel the weight of whatever words lay inside. James's final thoughts, his last chance to speak across the void that had separated them for 30 years. "What does it say?" Cuck heard himself ask, though his voice sounded foreign to his own ears. "The truth." Devon's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. About what really happened on that set in 1993. About who was actually responsible for Tommy Hendricks breaking his neck. About the real reason the insurance investigation went the way it did. The name hit Cuck like a physical blow. Tommy Hendricks. 24 years old, married for 6 months, dreams of becoming the next Hal Needham. Instead, he'd ended up paralyzed from the chest down because of a stunt that went wrong, a safety harness that failed, and an investigation that needed someone to blame. "Your father wasn't responsible for that accident," Cuck said, the words scraping his throat raw. "The harness was sabotaged." Devon's voice was cold as winter steel, by someone who knew exactly which bolt to loosen, exactly how to make it look like equipment failure instead of negligence. Someone who'd learned enough about stunt safety to know how to beat the system. The desert spun around them. Cuck felt his knees threaten to buckle, felt 30 years of carefully maintained lies crumbling like ancient walls. The letter in Devon's hand seemed to pulse with accusatory power, and he could almost hear James Cross's voice speaking across the years. "He figured it out," Devon continued relentlessly. "Took him 3 years, but he put the pieces together. Found the witness who saw someone tampering with equipment. Discovered the payoff that kept that witness quiet. Learned about the studio executive who promised a certain young actor that his cooperation in the investigation would be remembered when casting decisions were made." Cuck's vision blurred at the edges. The hawk overhead cried again, a sound like judgment being passed. Around them, the fake western town seemed to mock him with its artificial authenticity, its careful construction designed to look real while hiding the hollow framework beneath. "So here's what's going to happen," Devon said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "You're going to read this letter. You're going to remember what kind of man you used to be before you traded your soul for stardom. And then you're going to help me give my father the one thing he never got." The envelope trembled in Devon's outstretched hand. Cuck stared at it, knowing that the moment he touched it, there would be no going back. No more hiding behind carefully crafted interviews and charitable foundations. No more pretending the guilt that gnawed at him in the dark hours before dawn was just the price of success. "Justice," Devon whispered. "Early development." Cuck's hand moved toward the envelope as if drawn by invisible wire, then stopped 6 inches away. The tremor in his fingers was barely perceptible, but Devon caught it. Those sharp blue eyes missing nothing, cataloging every micro-expression like evidence for a trial that had been 30 years in the making. "No." The word came out rougher than Cuck intended. He pulled his hand back, clenching it into a fist at his side. "Whatever game you think you're playing, son, it ends here." Devon's laugh was soft, almost musical. "Game? You think this is a game?" He tucked the envelope back inside his jacket with theatrical precision. "That's interesting. My father dying in poverty while you collected your Third People's Choice Award. Was that a game too?" The desert heat pressed against them like a physical weight. But Cuck felt cold spreading through his chest. This couldn't be happening. Not now, not on this picture, not when he was so close to walking away clean. 30 years of careful image management, of strategic charity work and humble interviews, all designed to bury the past so deep it would never surface. "I don't know what you think you know. I know everything." Devon's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. "Every detail, every lie, every person you paid to keep quiet." He stepped closer, and Cuck caught a whiff of expensive cologne mixed with something else, the metallic scent of barely controlled rage. "The only question is whether you're going to make this easy or hard." A sound caught Cuck's attention, footsteps in the sand behind him. He turned to see Marcus Webb approaching, his weathered face creased with concern. But there was something else in the old director's expression, something that looked almost like fear. "Cuck." Marcus's voice was carefully neutral. "We need to talk, privately." "No." Devon's interruption was sharp as gunfire. "No more private conversations. No more backroom deals. Everything happens in the light now." Marcus stopped 20 feet away, his eyes darting between them like a man watching a fuse burn toward dynamite. His hands hung at his sides, but Cuck could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw worked silently as if chewing words he couldn't quite bring himself to speak. Marcus Cuck kept his voice steady, authoritative. The voice that had commanded respect on 100 sets, that had made studio executives listen and agents return calls. "Clear the area. Production meeting in my trailer in 5 minutes. But Marcus didn't move. For the first time in 23 years of collaboration, Marcus Webb stood frozen, staring at Devin Cross like he'd seen a ghost walking across the desert sand. "You remember him, don't you?" Devin asked, his attention shifting to Marcus with predatory focus. "The old man who used to handle the paperwork, who signed off on the safety reports, who knew exactly what forms to file to make an investigation disappear." The color drained from Marcus's face, leaving him pale as bleached bone. His mouth opened, closed, opened again without sound. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Jesus Christ, you're James's boy." "I'm James Cross's son," Devin corrected, his voice sharp with old pain. "The son who watched his father drink himself to death because good men like you decided covering up the truth was easier than doing what was right." Cuck watched Marcus crumble in real time. The man who had directed 43 films, who had commanded sets with military precision, who had never shown fear in the face of temperamental stars or impossible deadlines, suddenly looked every one of his 71 years. "Marcus, walk away." Cuck's command carried the weight of decades of friendship, of shared secrets and mutual protection. "This doesn't concern you." But Devin laughed, the sound echoing off the plywood facades like mockery of the artificial town around them. "Doesn't concern him? He's the one who doctored the safety reports. He's the one who made sure the insurance investigators never saw the real incident documentation. You think this was a one-man operation?" The words hit like physical blows. Cuck felt his carefully constructed world tilting on its axis, 30 years of buried truth threatening to avalanche into the light. Around them, the desert seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to break. Marcus took a step backward, then another. His eyes were wide, wild, like a cornered animal looking for escape routes. When he spoke, his voice cracked like old leather. I should call legal. The studio needs to know about this." No. Both men spoke simultaneously, but for vastly different reasons. Cuck wanted to contain the damage. Devin wanted to control the revelation. But Marcus was already backing away, pulling his phone from his pocket with shaking hands. 30 years of keeping secrets had prepared him for many things, but not for this. Not for the past walking out of the desert demanding payment for old debts. Devin watched him go, that predatory smile never leaving his face. "Running away," he said quietly. "Just like before. Middle development." The words hung in the desert air like a death sentence. Marcus stumbled backward another few steps, his phone clutched against his chest like a shield, before turning and half-running toward the production trailers. His retreat kicked up small clouds of dust that settled slowly in the still air, marking his escape route with tiny monuments to cowardice. Cuck watched him go and felt something fundamental break inside his chest. Marcus Webb, steady, dependable Marcus who had covered for him for over 2 decades, was abandoning ship. The man who had helped bury the truth so deep it should never have seen daylight was now fleeing like the desert was on fire. 30 years of loyalty, Devin observed, his tone almost conversational. Gone in 30 seconds. Makes you wonder what kind of foundation you really built your empire on, doesn't it? Cuck turned back to face him, and for the first time in 3 decades, he felt truly exposed. Without Marcus standing beside him, without the buffer of crew and cameras and the familiar choreography of a film set, there was nowhere to hide from those piercing blue eyes that held too much knowledge. "He's scared," Cuck said, though the words sounded weak even to his own ears. "He should be." Devin reached into his jacket again, but this time he withdrew a different envelope. Newer, crisp, white paper with the letterhead of a law firm visible through the thin paper. Because my father's letter wasn't the only evidence he left behind. The sight of legal stationery sent ice water through Cuck's veins. This wasn't just about emotional revenge anymore. This was about consequences that could destroy everything he'd spent 30 years building. "Bank records," Devin continued, his voice gaining momentum like an avalanche. "Showing payments to Tommy Hendrix's family that were supposed to come from the studio's insurance settlement, but actually came from a private account. Guess whose signature was on those transfers?" Cuck's mouth went dry. He remembered those payments, monthly checks that had continued for 15 years until Tommy finally succumbed to complications from his paralysis. Cuck had told himself it was penance, that it somehow balanced the scales of what had happened. But legally, those payments were an admission of guilt that could be traced directly back to him. And then there are the medical records. Devin pressed on relentlessly. The real ones, not the versions that made it into the official investigation file. Tommy was conscious for 40 minutes after the accident. 40 minutes of telling anyone who would listen that someone had been messing with his equipment before the stunt. The paramedics documented everything. Each revelation hit like a physical blow. Cuck felt his knees threatening to buckle, felt the desert spinning around him in lazy circles. The fake western town suddenly felt like a prison, its wooden facades closing in like the walls of a confession booth. How? The words scraped out of his throat like broken glass. Devin's smile was sharp as a blade. My father never stopped investigating, even after they destroyed his career. Even after the industry blacklisted him, he kept digging. 15 years of following paper trails and tracking down witnesses and collecting evidence that nobody else cared about because the case was officially closed. The desert wind shifted, carrying the scent of approaching storm clouds. In the distance, Cuck could see the production trailers clustered around the catering area like covered wagons circling against a tack. Marcus would be in there now, probably on the phone with studio lawyers, trying to figure out how to contain a disaster that was already spiraling beyond control. He was going to go public, Devin continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. Had it all planned out, press conference, media blitz, the whole thing. He was finally going to clear his name and make sure everyone knew what really happened to Tommy Hendricks. Cuck closed his eyes, seeing James Cross as he'd been in those final days on the 1993 set. Proud, dignified, trusting right up until the moment the industry he'd served faithfully for 20 years turned its back on him. James had believed in justice, in the system, in the idea that good men would ultimately do the right thing. But he never did it, Cuck said, opening his eyes to find Devin watching him with those unsettling blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. No, Devin's voice carried an ocean of old pain, because 3 days before the press conference, he had his heart attack. Died alone in that motel room, with boxes of evidence scattered around him and your name written on every piece of paper. The silence that followed was deafening. Somewhere overhead, that hawk cried again, a sound like judgment being passed from the heavens. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, vast and unforgiving, holding secrets in its depths that could swallow a man's sins or expose them to the merciless sun. Devin pulled out his phone, and Cuck watched with growing horror as he began scrolling through what looked like photographs, dozens of them, documents and records and evidence that should have been buried with James Cross 15 years ago. So here's what's going to happen, Devin said, his thumb hovering over the screen. We're going to finish what my father started. Plot twist. Cuck stared at the phone screen, watching Devin's thumb hover over what looked like a contact list. The names were blurry in the desert heat, but he could make out enough to feel his world tilting further off its axis. Entertainment Tonight. TMZ, The Hollywood Reporter. Every major outlet that could turn his carefully constructed legacy into rubble with a single story. Wait, Cuck said, his voice hoarse. Just wait. Devin's thumb paused, but his expression remained coldly expectant. Waiting is what my father did for 15 years. Waiting for you to grow a conscience. Waiting for someone else to care about the truth, waiting for justice that never came. The words hit like physical blows, but something else was nagging at Cuck, a detail that didn't fit, a piece of the puzzle that seemed wrong. He'd been so focused on the horror of exposure, so terrified of the evidence Devin claimed to possess, that he'd missed something fundamental. Your father died 15 years ago, Cuck said slowly, his mind racing. You said he was planning a press conference, that he had all this evidence compiled. That's right. But you can't be more than 25 years old. Cuck's voice gained strength as the inconsistency crystallized. Which means, when the accident happened in 1993, you were what, 10? 11? For the first time since this confrontation began, something flickered across Devin's face. It was barely perceptible, a tightening around the eyes, a slight stiffening of his shoulders, but Cuck caught it. After 30 years of reading people on film sets, of watching for the micro-expressions that revealed when an actor was struggling with their lines. He recognized the telltale signs of someone whose story was about to crumble. "Age doesn't matter when it comes to justice," Devon said, but his voice lacked the confident edge it had carried moments before. "Doesn't it?" Cuck took a step closer, feeling something like hope stirring in his chest for the first time since this nightmare began. A 10-year-old boy, watching his father's career destroyed, his family torn apart. That kind of trauma doesn't usually produce master manipulators capable of orchestrating elaborate revenge schemes. Devon's hand tightened around his phone, and Cuck saw sweat beading on the young man's forehead despite the afternoon heat being no worse than it had been minutes earlier. "You want to know what it produces?" Devon's voice cracked slightly. "It produces a kid who spent his childhood listening to his father ramble about conspiracies and cover-ups while he drank himself to death in a series of increasingly shitty apartments." The admission came out raw, unguarded, and Cuck realized with sudden, startling clarity that he was seeing the real Devon Cross for the first time. Not the confident antagonist who had been pulling his strings, but a damaged young man carrying wounds that had never properly healed. "James Cross wasn't investigating anything for 15 years, Cuck said quietly. He was a broken man who couldn't let go of the past. "Shut up." But Devon's voice was barely a whisper. "There is no evidence. No smoking gun. No carefully compiled case that will vindicate your father's memory." Cuck felt the truth settling around him like dust after an explosion. There's just a son who grew up hearing stories about the great injustice that destroyed his family, and who decided to write his own ending. Devon's phone trembled in his hand. The confident predator who had been systematically dismantling Cuck's defenses was disappearing before his eyes, replaced by something much younger and infinitely more fragile. "You don't know what it was like," Devon said, and his voice carried the echo of every childhood spent in the shadow of a parent's obsession. Watching him drink, listening to him tell the same stories over and over about how Cuck Norris ruined his life, how if there was any justice in the world, someone would make you pay. The desert seemed to exhale around them, releasing heat that had been building all day. In the distance, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, promising relief that might never come. "So you made yourself that someone," Cuck said. "I tried." Devon's thumb moved away from the phone screen, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "God help me. I really thought I could do it. I thought if I got close enough, if I pushed hard enough, I could make you confess to something, anything, just so he could finally be right about one thing." The truth hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. All of Devon's confidence, all of his calculated moves and dramatic revelations, it had all been the desperate improvisation of a young man trying to give meaning to his father's wasted life. "But there's nothing to confess to, is there?" Devon's voice was barely audible. "James Cross destroyed his own career through incompetence and pride, and you just happened to be standing close enough to catch the blame." For the first time in 30 years, Cuck felt the weight of buried guilt shift on his shoulders. Not because he was innocent, he knew exactly how guilty he was, but because the son seeking justice had been looking for the wrong crime entirely. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, vibrating with unspoken truths. Cuck watched Devon's phone slip slightly in his sweating palm, the screen going dark, and felt the terrible weight of recognition settling in his chest. The boy was right about one thing. There was nothing to confess to regarding James Cross's downfall. But that didn't make Cuck innocent. "You want to know the truth about your father?" Cuck's voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by decades of careful silence. "James Cross was the best coordinator I ever worked with. Professional, thorough, someone who cared more about safety than schedules. He would have caught what I did to Tommy's equipment. He would have stopped it." Devon's head snapped up, those blue eyes focusing with laser intensity. "What are you saying?" Cuck felt something fundamental shifting inside him, like tectonic plates finally giving way after years of mounting pressure. The desert around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for words that had been 30 years in the making. "Your father didn't destroy his own career," Cuck continued, each word feeling like a step off a cliff. "I destroyed it for him. Systematically, deliberately, because he was asking the right questions about Tommy Hendricks, and I couldn't let him find the answers." The admission hung between them like a physical presence. In the distance, Cuck could see movement around the production trailers. Crew members going about their business, oblivious to the fact that their director's entire world was cracking open like an egg. Devon's phone slipped from his fingers entirely, hitting the sand with a soft thud. "You're lying." "The safety reports Marcus doctored." I told him which sections to alter, the witnesses who suddenly couldn't remember what they'd seen. I knew which ones could be bought and which ones just needed to be scared. "Your father's reputation for drinking on set?" Cuck's voice gained momentum, 30 years of buried guilt spilling out like blood from a severed artery. "I planted those bottles. I made sure the right people found them." "Stop." Devon's voice was barely a whisper. But Cuck couldn't stop now, even if he wanted to. The dam had burst, and everything he'd spent 3 decades burying was rushing to the surface with the force of a flash flood. I convinced the union to launch that ethics investigation. I fed them just enough real evidence mixed with carefully crafted lies to make it stick. And when your father tried to fight back, when he hired that private investigator to clear his name, I made sure every door in Hollywood slammed shut before he could get close to the truth. Devon was backing away now, his face pale as desert bone. "Why? Why would you do that to him?" The question cut deeper than any accusation. Cuck looked at this young man, James Cross's son, carrying his father's eyes and his father's stubborn jaw, and saw the wreckage of a family destroyed not by accident or incompetence, but by calculated malice. "Because I was 28 years old and ambitious as cancer," Cuck said. "Because Tommy Hendricks was supposed to be my big break, the stunt coordinator who could handle the impossible, shots that would make actors into action stars. And when my equipment modifications went wrong, when Tommy got hurt because I cut corners to save $300 on cable specifications, I had a choice to make." The storm clouds on the horizon were moving closer now, their shadows racing across the desert floor like dark prophecies. Somewhere in those production trailers, Marcus was probably trying to manage damage control for a crisis he didn't even fully understand yet. "I chose my career over justice," Cuck continued, his voice gaining strength even as his soul crumbled. "I chose my future over your father's reputation. I chose my secrets over an innocent man's life." Devon stumbled backward until his legs hit one of the wooden storefronts. The fake facade groaned under his weight, a sound like the whole artificial town was about to collapse. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of misdirected anger, finally finding its true target. "All those years," he whispered. "All those years he drank himself to death believing he'd failed, believing he was incompetent, worthless, that he'd let Tommy down through his own negligence." "Yes, and you let him, yes." The single word carried the weight of 30 years of cowardice. Cuck stood in the center of that fake western town, surrounded by artificial facades and hollow buildings, and finally understood that he'd been living inside a lie so complete it had become indistinguishable from reality. Devon's phone buzzed in the sand where it had fallen, the screen lighting up with an incoming call. Neither man moved to answer it. In the distance, thunder rumbled like the sound of judgment finally arriving, 30 years late, but inevitable as gravity. The point of no return wasn't coming anymore. It was here, climax. The thunder rolled closer, and with it came the first drops of rain, fat, heavy drops that struck the sand with tiny puffs of dust, each one like a period at the end of a 30-year sentence. Cuck watched Devon's face cycle through emotions too complex for any single expression: rage, grief, vindication, and something deeper that looked like the terrible relief of finally understanding the shape of his own wounds. "He knew," Devon said, his voice hollow as an echo in a canyon. "Didn't he? At the end, when the drinking got bad, when he'd sit in that chair for hours just staring at nothing, he knew someone had destroyed him on purpose." Cuck felt his throat constrict. "I think so, yes. And he never fought back. Never tried to expose you." Devon's hands were shaking now, whether from rage or shock, Cuck couldn't tell. "Why? Why didn't he destroy you the way you destroyed him?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Cuck closed his eyes and saw James Cross as he'd been in those final days on set. Not the broken man he'd become, but the mentor who'd taught a young stunt coordinator that the job wasn't about making heroes look good, it was about bringing everyone home alive. Because he was a better man than me, Cuck said simply. Because, even knowing what I'd done, he couldn't bring himself to destroy another person's life, even mine. Devon made a sound that might have been laughter or sobbing. Jesus Christ. He protected you. Even after everything, he protected you. The rain was falling harder now, turning the dust around their feet into mud. Somewhere behind them, Cuck could hear voices calling. Crew members probably wondering where their director had disappeared to, whether they should start moving equipment before the storm hit in earnest. The normal concerns of normal people living normal lives that didn't include carrying the weight of another man's death for 30 years. What happens now? Devon asked. And for the first time since this confrontation began, he sounded like what he was, a young man in over his head, drowning in revelations too large for any one person to process. Cuck looked at James Cross's son, at this boy who'd spent months planning an elaborate revenge against the wrong crime, and felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 decades, the possibility of redemption that wasn't purchased with silence. Now you have a choice, Cuck said, the same choice I had 30 years ago. You can destroy me, and you have every right to. One phone call to any reporter, and my career, my reputation, everything I've built turns to ash. Or what? Cuck pulled out his own phone, scrolled to a contact he'd never thought he'd use. The screen showed the number for Sarah Chen, the investigative reporter who'd been trying to get an interview with him for years, the one who specialized in cold cases and Hollywood cover-ups. Or we tell the truth together, all of it. What I did to Tommy, what I did to your father, what Marcus helped me hide. We make sure the whole story comes out, and we make sure Tommy's family finally gets the justice they deserved 30 years ago. Devon stared at the phone in Cuck's outstretched hand. That destroys you anyway. Prison, lawsuits, disgrace. Why offer me a choice at all? Because your father deserves better than being a footnote in my downfall, Cuck said. Because the story should be about him, his integrity, his principles, the fact that he was the only one who cared more about the truth than about protecting himself. And because Tommy Hendricks deserves better than being the dirty secret that built my empire. The storm was fully upon them now, rain falling in sheets that turned the fake western town into a blur of brown and gray. Cuck felt water running down his face, washing away dust and sweat, and the careful mask he'd worn for so long that he'd forgotten what lay beneath it. Devon reached for the phone with trembling fingers. For a moment, their hands touched as the device passed between them, and Cuck felt the strange sensation of a burden lifting, not disappearing, but becoming shared, distributed across shoulders strong enough to bear it. He would have forgiven you, Devon said quietly, rain plastering his hair to his forehead. That's the worst part, isn't it? If you'd gone to him 30 years ago, if you'd told him the truth and asked for help fixing it, he would have forgiven you. I know, Cuck whispered. I've known that every single day since. Devon's thumb hovered over the reporter's number, and in that moment of hesitation, Cuck saw not the instrument of his destruction, but the son of the man he should have been. The thunder crashed overhead like the sound of a world ending, and perhaps it was. The world built on lies and cowardice and 30 years of careful silence. But from its ashes, something else might grow. Something that looked like justice, arrived 30 years late but no less real for its delay. Devon pressed the call button. The call connected on the 3rd ring. Sarah Chen. Devon's voice caught in his throat. The rain was falling harder now, turning the western set into a watercolor painting bleeding at the edges. He looked at Cuck, who nodded once, a gesture that somehow contained both permission and absolution. Ms. Chen, my name is Devon Cross. I'm calling about a story that happened 30 years ago in Almeria. A story about Tommy Hendricks, James Cross, and Cuck Norris. Cuck couldn't hear the reporter's response over the storm, but he saw Devon's face change, the last traces of boyish uncertainty washing away with the rain. When Devon began to speak, his voice carried his father's measured cadence, his father's careful attention to detail. The confession took 40 minutes. Devon spoke first, explaining who he was and why he'd come to Spain. Then Cuck took the phone, his voice steady as he detailed 3 decades of buried truth, the equipment modifications, the cover-up, the systematic destruction of James Cross's career. Sarah Chen asked sharp, probing questions that cut like surgical instruments, exposing the infected tissue of lies until nothing remained but raw, honest pain. When it was over, they stood in the rain without speaking. The storm had transformed the fake Western town into something almost real. Mud-slicked streets, sagging facades, the kind of place where broken men came to die with their secrets intact. But the secrets were gone now, carried away on electromagnetic waves to a woman in Los Angeles who would ensure they could never be buried again. "She'll want documentation," Devin said finally. "Evidence." Marcus kept everything: insurance policies, safety reports, financial records. 30 years of careful documentation to protect us from exactly this moment. Cuck's laugh held no humor. "He won't destroy it. He's too much of a professional for that, even now." They walked back toward the production trailers in silence, their footsteps squelching in the mud. Crew members huddled under awnings, waiting for the storm to pass so they could resume the careful business of making lies look like truth. When Marcus saw them approaching, his face went through a complex series of calculations: hope, confusion, and finally, resigned understanding. "It's over," Cuck told him simply. Marcus closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, something fundamental had changed. The careful choreography of damage control, the instinctive calculations about spin and plausible deniability, all of it fell away, leaving behind a man who looked older and somehow cleaner. "Good," he said, and meant it. The story broke 18 hours later. Sarah Chen's article was thorough, devastating, and fair in ways that surprised Cuck. She painted James Cross not as a victim, but as a professional whose integrity had cost him everything. Tommy Hendricks emerged not as collateral damage, but as the man whose accident had revealed the fundamental corruption at the heart of an industry that valued spectacle over safety. Cuck was arrested 3 days later in his hotel room. The Spanish authorities were polite, professional, and utterly indifferent to his celebrity. The charges were extensive: criminal negligence, conspiracy, fraud, perjury. Enough to ensure he would spend his remaining years learning the weight of consequences finally delivered. But it was the civil lawsuits that mattered. Tommy Hendricks' family received a settlement that could never restore his mobility, but might ease his final years. James Cross was posthumously vindicated by industry organizations that had blacklisted him. The Stunt Coordinators Union established a safety foundation in his name. Devin visited once, in the Madrid jail where Cuck awaited extradition. They sat across from each other in a room designed to contain dangerous men, and spoke quietly about fathers and the weight of inherited pain. "He would have been proud of you," Cuck said, "for telling the truth, for choosing justice over revenge." Devin considered this. "I think he would have been proud of you too, for finally becoming the man he thought you were 30 years ago." 6 months later, Cuck stood in a California courtroom and heard his sentence: 8 years for criminal negligence, to be served concurrently with civil penalties that would strip him of everything he'd built on the foundation of lies. The judge was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and an implacable voice who spoke about justice delayed but not denied. As the bailiff led him away, Cuck caught sight of Devin in the gallery. James Cross's son had gotten a haircut and wore a suit that made him look older, more settled. He was holding hands with a young woman Cuck didn't recognize. Someone, perhaps, who had known Devin only as himself, not as the son of a destroyed man seeking justice for crimes that lived only in memory. Devin nodded once as their eyes met. It was a small gesture, but it contained multitudes, forgiveness, understanding, and the strange peace that comes when the weight of the past finally shifts from burden to memory. The California sky outside the courthouse was clear and blue, unmarked by the storms that had swept through their lives. Somewhere in that desert in Spain, the fake Western town still stood, waiting for the next story to unfold within its carefully constructed lies. But this story, their story, was finally complete.